Mr. Guzman knows Brown well. He graduated with a PhD in economics from Brown in 2013, having authored a dissertation, oddly, on the causes and effects of financial crises. Prior to becoming minister in December 2019, he was a researcher at the Columbia University School of Business and director of their public debt restructuring program. He's currently an associate professor of the Faculty of Economic Sciences of the University of Buenos Aires and is a tenured lecturer at the School of Economic Sciences of the National University of La Plata. He was also, by many accounts, an exceptional soccer player during his time at Brown, and was a member of winning teams called Volvox and, most appropriately for an economist, Random Walk. Someone else who is no stranger to Brown is William Bill Rhodes, a member of the class of 1957, the benefactor of the Rhodes Center, and the chair which I am proud to take as mine, who is the founder behind the Rhodes Center and also the benefactor behind the William Rhodes Dissertation Fellowship, which Minister Guzman was the recipient of when he was a PhD student. Bill's entire career was spent in financial markets, including the Latin American debt restructurings of the 1980s, and we've asked him to set up the minister's talk for us with a focus on how he sees Argentina's challenges going forward. A few matters of housekeeping before we begin. We need to keep this event to an hour. You still have time to keep this to an hour and still have time for meaningful audience engagement. If you're on the local Brown Zoom and you have a question, please put it in the Q&A function of Zoom. If you're watching on YouTube Live, please put your question in the comments. We have people monitoring both sources. When we get to the Q&A, to avoid complications with muting and unmuting, I shall relay the questions to the minister. And with that, over to you, Bill, to open us up. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and it's a great honor and pleasure to be able to introduce Martín Guzmán here today. As a person who first visited Argentina when I was a student at Brown, I have followed the Argentine economy very closely ever since. And with my banking career, I restructured the sovereign debt of the country on 5 different occasions. During that period, it had numerous agreements with the International Monetary Fund to support its economic reform programs. Last year, Minister Guzman successfully renegotiated the Argentine debt, again, with a supporting package from the International Monetary Fund. Argentina is due to renew its IMF financial support package in May of this year. And my first question to Martín is, what will be the difference in this support packages from the International Monetary Fund programs that we have seen in the past? My second question is that Argentina, along with a number of other countries in Latin America, has been very hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and recently signed an agreement with Russia to utilize the Sputnik V vaccine. How is this program going, and how is Argentina going to finance it? My third and last question is that Argentina, a number of the provinces, appear to be actively borrowing in domestic currency over the last few months. If this is the case, what are the funds being used for, and will this in any way impact the very important negotiations with the fund in May? Thank you. I turn it over to you, Martín.
Thank you very much, Mark and Bill. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be sharing this presentation, and also to do a presentation at Brown University. I wish I could be there. I very much I had an enormous pleasure, and it was a great moment in life when I was at Brown doing my PhD from 2008 to 2013. We know these are difficult times with COVID. Hopefully the next time will be there in person. So let me thank you again, Bill, for the questions and for the work you've been doing for decades. I'm going to respond to each of them, but I will start providing a brief overview of the situation Argentina has historically been facing, the situation that the country has been facing over the last few years, and what the pandemic brought us, and how we've been dealing with the pandemic and with the other challenges at the macroeconomic level. So for starters, Argentina has had a long history of booms and busts. The economy for decades has suffered from not just macroeconomic volatility, but also volatility of the trend. The output trend has changed drastically many times over the last few decades. This is something different than what other economies with volatility experience, that they mostly experience volatility of the cycle, not volatility of the trend. Let me tell you an anecdote. I was last year at the G20 meeting, one of the private meetings. I was discussing Argentina's economy with one of the finance ministers of G7 economy. And at some point he said, this is too alien for me when hearing about Argentina's economy. But I know I'm facing an audience that is interested in what's going on in Argentina and ready to understand the challenges that we're going through. In 2016, Argentina, after a long battle in New York courts with creditors that had bought Argentina's debt on the cheap and had litigated against Argentina, reaccessed international credit markets, and the country started to borrow. There was a perception by creditors that Argentina was going to follow with some probability a vibrant path of economic growth. The government by then was considering that this was something that could actually happen, and the country started to borrow, but only 2 years later, there was a massive change in expectations. The change in expectations led to a classic sudden stop in capital flows and the beginning of a macroeconomic crisis that came with an acute currency crisis. Debt became unsustainable and a restructuring was needed. We took office on December 2019, a few months before the pandemic hit the world. One of our initial goals was precisely to restructure the debt denominated in foreign currency with foreign creditors and take it to sustainable levels. But COVID-19 hit the economy, hit the war and hit Argentina, and it led to a redefinition of priorities and a redefinition of the logistics and the process for the debt restructuring negotiations. In terms of how we reacted to COVID-19, and this will address Bill's second question, we basically defined 3 principles for reacting to the challenges that the pandemic imposed. The first principle was that health was the #1 priority, and we had to take measures of reducing circulation of people, circulation of goods, in order to avoid that the virus spread too rapidly and damage and it was incompatible with what the health system could bear. This, of course, had economic consequences. We defined 2 other principles to deal with economic consequences. The second principle was that we had to adopt policies to protect the most vulnerable, the ones that fell into a situation of vulnerability because of the consequences of the pandemic, also the economic consequences of the pandemic. And the third one was that we had to preserve the organizational capital and jobs. It was very important to avoid hysteresis effects, to avoid long-lasting effects of COVID-19 on the economy, that we make sure that firms remain alive, that jobs were protected. So we adopted a number of policies that had to do with those principles, including transfers, direct transfers of cash, reductions of taxes that affected labor, direct subsidies of wages in the private sector, and other measures, including subsidized credit in order to make sure that we're protecting jobs and we were protecting firms. We had to do this in the context of a debt crisis. And in a debt crisis, there is virtually no access to credit. So that raised the level of the challenge. But in the meantime, we conducted a debt restructuring process. Well, Bill knows a lot about this. Bill has been one of the most influential persons in the history of debt restructurings. And he knows the complexities that get involved in that restructuring process. You can imagine when you add the impossibility of traveling, what this means in terms of logistics, in terms of a negotiation process, in which it's of course easier when people meet face to face, but luckily creditors continue the engagement with Argentina, and we managed to sort out the logistical issues through video conferences. For the restructuring, we basically decided a strategy that attempted at different goals. First goal, what did we want at the time of doing the restructuring? We wanted to restore debt sustainability, to make sure that we were taking commitments that the country could fulfill. We did not want to make empty promises. It is in the history of the restructurings, we've seen many cases in which the size of relief comes in the form of too little, or it comes too late. And when it comes in the form of too little, later on, the restructuring has to be done again, and the consequences are well known. The economies don't get the capacity and the conditions, don't restore the conditions that are necessary for restoring economic growth, for putting the economy back to work. So we wanted a sustainable debt restructuring process. The second goal was to do it orderly. We wanted to avoid a disorderly restructuring that could be associated with problems later on, and we thought of the restructuring as a first step towards building a constructive relationship with our investors. So that's why, despite the fact that when we took office, it was obvious that debt was already unsustainable, we, the executive, the government, asked Congress to be able to use part of the foreign reserves of the central bank to continue serving interest payments for some time while we conducted an orderly debt restructuring process. We knew that there was a risk. There was a risk that creditors did not accept the debt sustainability constraints, but we wanted to have a chance to give a shot at this. Then we engaged with the international community and the domestic community in building a common sense on what Argentina needed. The International Monetary Fund produced a technical note on debt sustainability, a debt sustainability analysis that was very similar to the debt sustainability analysis that Argentina's government had produced, and defined the debt sustainability constraints that were very close to the ones that we had defined. We got the support from a number of members of the G20, massive support from the international academic community, a letter of support to Argentina's restructuring process from more than 150 economists, including 4 Nobel Prizes. And we also got massive support domestically. Congress, the National Congress passed 2 laws that were critical for conducting the restructuring process with almost unanimity in both chambers. There was support from the academic community, support from the private sector. It was a process in which there were ups and downs, and at the end, after a few months, we managed to finalize the restructuring process. Collective action clauses were activated, and we had an acceptance rate, a final rate of 99%. As in every restructuring process, it's very difficult to identify every single bondholder. So this 99% was equivalent to virtually having no holdouts. This was a very important result for us, because not only there was a substantial reduction in the scheduled debt payments of about $37 billion over the course of the next 10 years, and a reduction of the coupon rate, the interest rate, from an average of 7% in US dollars to 3.07%, plus a reduction of in face value of 1.9%. Not only that happened, but also there will be no litigation. So this is another important aspect of what was achieved. This was just a necessary condition for economic recovery, not a sufficient one. We are now in a process of putting the macroeconomy in order, and in a process in which we had an economic program of which the budget for 2021 is the centerpiece that attempts at a number of goals. First, sustain economic recovery. Second, reducing inflation. Going to Bill's first question, the IMF. Let me again give you a bit of background. In 2018, when the macroeconomic crisis, when the change in expectations happened, Argentina's government quickly resorted to seek an IMF program, and a standby agreement was achieved. This standby agreement was based basically on two macroeconomic pillars. First, the idea that a fiscal austerity in times of recession would be effective to restore confidence, and therefore Argentina would reaccess international credit markets at sustainable rates. Well, Mark is one of the persons in the world who knows most about how dangerous this idea is. It did not work. Basically, fiscal austerity in the context of a recession basically deepened the recession. The second macro pillar of the previous program was that contraction in monetary policy in the context of a recession was going to be effective to stabilize prices, to reduce inflation. It did not work either. Prices did not stabilize. On the contrary, inflation increased. And what happened was that the contraction in monetary policy in the context of persistent inflation led to a reduction of credit in real terms and a large increase in the interest rate, which contributed to deepen the economic recession. So, Bill, with respect to your question, what will be different? Well, what we're doing is first to remember what happened in the past, to avoid those mistakes. We're working constructively with the fund staff in order to build a program that works, a program that is based on different tenets, understanding what the structural problems, the macroeconomic problems of Argentina actually are, and understanding that there is one principle that has to be respected, which is that there is no economic stabilization if there is no economic recovery. Therefore, the program has to be designed with economic recovery as a first goal. This program is a program that we are defining a number of goals, both for the external front and from the domestic front. Argentina, for instance, needs an accumulation of foreign reserves in order to build a resilience, build resilience that gives us more exchange rate stability. We also need to resolve the problems of the fiscal deficit at a pace and in a way that is consistent with sustained economic recovery. All these details are under discussion now. We hope to continue building mutual understanding. This is something that has been happening. There has been a process of building mutual understanding, and we continue doing the same, and also building a common sense at the international and at the domestic level on what will work for Argentina. Let me finalize with our role in the international community. We been going through a number of years in which multilateralism was not working well. And if there was a time at which, at least in the last few decades, in which cooperation was more important, are these times. So Argentina, as a member of the G20 and a member of the IMF, will look forward and will continue working alongside the other countries of the world in order to be a more inclusive, a more equitable, and a more dynamic global economy. The world faces massive challenges today, so it's much easier to navigate through these challenges if there is cooperation, and that's the role that Argentina, that's the position that Argentina will take and the role that we expect to play. Let me finalize my initial remarks here, and let me thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much for that, Martin. Because Bill was so parsimonious with his time, we're actually well ahead and we have plenty of time for questions and answers. We have a couple of them coming in. I encourage the participants in the audience to please send in more questions so we can build them up. In the meantime, I'm going to ask Bill if he wants to come back in and follow up on what the minister has just said as a way of sort of dovetailing that conversation. Would you like to come back in, Bill?
Thank you very much, Mark. I wanted to follow up on the question, Martin, as to how the implementation of the program with the with Argentina is going with the Sputnik 5 vaccine, because as you know, that's been one that's been questioned quite a lot. And the Russians are pointing to the number of people that Argentina is going to be vaccinating as an example of how their Sputnik 5 is actually going to function. And over the years, Argentina has had a tremendous, I think, public health system. And so I think you could be the example for other spots in the world that are planning to use this vaccine. And I'm just wondering if you have any early indications of how this is going.
Thank you, Bill. So, yeah, with regard to the vaccine, we signed a deal with Argentina, signed a deal with Russia for the provision of vaccines. And this is something that every week the country receives a number of doses. And the vaccination plan is going in terms of the definition of priorities as it was initially defined by the Ministry of Health of the Republic of Argentina. Of course, the vaccination campaign will be very important for dealing with the pandemic. And we had a positive start. And like every country in the world, we expect to be able to have a rapid process of vaccination. In the meantime, the pandemic is still here. The economy is already recovering. It's been on a recovery for a number of months with a heterogeneous pattern. There are some sectors of the economy that require a social proximity that suffer still the consequences of the pandemic. For instance, the tourism sector, clearly. There are other sectors that have been recovering at a faster pace, the one that do not require social proximity. Our expectation is that as long as the pandemic gives us a break, then the economy will establish a more solid recovery.
I think, Mark, I would have one other question before you open it up. Fortunately, you had some good news, Martin, in the sense that YPF was able to reach an agreement with his creditors this weekend. And I'm just wondering, are there any of the provinces at this particular point in time? I know the province of Buenos Aires had, foreign debt, sovereign debt problems. And I'm just wondering how that is going, because you, in Argentina, you have so much autonomy in the provinces. How is that program going? And is it supportive of what you did on the restructuring package for the sovereign, Argentina, and for the work you're doing in trying to implement a reform program within the country?
Thank you very much, Bill, for asking this question. So the world recognized that Argentina did not have the capacity to meet the original debt contracts in the way they had been written. Argentina did not have the capacity to pay an average interest rate of 7% in US dollars. It was just something unfeasible. And there was a restructuring that was based on sustainability principles. With the provinces, what happens is that each province also is part of the country, and there is only one source of foreign revenue for the country, which is the difference between the exports and the imports. So the debt sustainability principles for the provinces have to be the same ones as for the country, for the sovereign nation, when it comes to debt service capacity in foreign currency, which is different than debt service capacity in domestic currency. The provinces, there are provinces that are still in the process of restructuring, and there are creditors that do not seem to understand the problem of debt sustainability in foreign currency for provinces that are part of a country in which there was a balance of payment crisis that meant basically that there were a scarce foreign exchange in order to meet debt payments. So this lack of understanding from a number of creditors on the debt sustainability constraints that the provinces face lead to processes that are lasting longer than the one that we conducted from the national government. Bill, you mentioned the province of Buenos Aires. That's an example in which the province of Buenos Aires has been leading a restructuring process that is aligned with the debt sustainability constraints that both Argentina's government and the IMF recognize, but it hasn't yet had an engagement of creditors in the sense of respecting the debt sustainability constraints that have been defined. So still, there have been substantial differences between what is sustainable and what creditors are demanding. And the same happens in other provinces. For us, what is of the essence is to do it right rather than to do it fast. And all provinces are fully engaged in the restructuring processes. All provinces are trying to achieve deals, but these deals have to be sustainable.
Mark, I turn it back to you.
Great, thanks, Bill. So I'm going to start pulling in the questions now that we've had submitted. There's some very good ones. So I'm going to group the first two of them together because the first one is rather expansive and the second one gets to the heart of it. So the first question is from Talborga, which is, as a fellow Argentinian, I'm interested in knowing, are you optimistic or pessimistic about Argentina's future? And the second one from Juan Pedro Ronconi is specifically, how do you plan to bring the fiscal deficit under control and put the economy on a sustainable path, especially when considering that the previous administration tried but failed to do so?
Thank you for both questions, Mark. So with respect to the first question, Argentina has underperformed with respect to its potential for many years. And what we are trying to do is to be realistic. Our economic policies are based on what we consider prudent assumptions. Over-optimism has been in the past associated with troubles. The idea that there were going to be large recoveries, very virtuous process of economic growth based on economic reforms has been associated with a process of indebtedness that didn't end up well. So we try to be prudent. The fiscal policies, the monetary policies, the macroeconomic policies in general are based on assumptions that we consider realistic and, as I said before, prudent. I think this is the way we should follow in order to make sure that what we do is aligned with the goal of stabilizing Argentina's economy. With respect to the second question, the fiscal deficit. Okay, very, very good question. So at the time we define the fiscal policies, we basically define two tenets. The first tenet is that given that economic recovery is a necessary condition for economic stabilization, and given that the country is in a recession, fiscal policy has to be counter-cyclical. It has to play a role in order to enable a recovery of the private sector. So it has to be an expansion of aggregate demand in which the state plays a role. But the second tenet is that fiscal sustainability is a pillar of economic stability. A country that has a recurrent and long-lasting fiscal deficit is a country that either borrows or resorts to financing from the central bank, to monetary financing. One way or another, problems are created. Either that problems if the economy doesn't grow sustainably, or a debilitation of the domestic currency. So the deficit has to, the corollary of that is that the deficit has to be reduced. This means that there are forces operating in opposite directions. On the one hand, the state has to play a counter-cyclical role in which the aggregate demand expands. On the other hand, the deficit has to be reduced. So this establishes a sort of thin corridor through which the economy has to transit, such that if there is too much expansion that requires more monetary financing, that will have destabilizing effects on the exchange rate, and that affects the stability of the economy. On the other side, if there is not enough expansion, if the state does not play a role for expanding aggregate demand, and that's what was done in the context of the previous program with IMF, which was contraction in fiscal policy, that is self-defeating for the economy. That leads to a decline in economic activity, a decline in fiscal revenues, and at the end, not even the fiscal problems are resolved. So that's how we plan to reduce the deficit, to navigate through this thin corridor in which the state plays a role for pushing economic recovery, but at the same time, we gradually reduce the deficit at a pace that is consistent with the recovery of the economy.
Thank you for that answer. On to the next question. Scott Schuler asked the following. It seems that inflation has become an expectation amongst Argentines, which creates a self-reinforcing cycle. What can you do to break that cycle?
Thank you for the question. Inflation. Inflation has been a problem for the workings of the economy for years. In order to reduce inflation, we first need to implement macroeconomic policies that resolve the imbalances of the economy. And that's what we're doing. But the imbalances of economy cannot be resolved in one shot. For instance, we need to accumulate foreign reserves. This is not something that can be done. We cannot reach the level of foreign reserves that would make the country, would put it in a state of comfort in terms of the exchange rate stability in one shot. So it takes time. Second, we need to reduce the fiscal deficit, and together with that, we need to reduce the financing, the monetary financing, the financing from the central bank to the treasury. But as I explained before, the reduction of the fiscal deficit has to occur at a certain pace, at a pace that is consistent with economic recovery. So this also puts a limit for the speed at which inflation can be reduced. On the other hand, the problems of inflation that are historic have led to behaviors, adaptive behaviors that reproduce the inflationary processes. So the state also plays a role during the transition in coordinating actions, in coordinating price and income wage policies such that expectations get aligned with what is feasible from a macroeconomic viewpoint. We have explained, or we have in the budget, in the 2021 budget, we have defined that we want to reduce inflation by a number of points in 2021. We define a target which is 29%. Within some range, of course, there is uncertainty and flexibility to recalibrate policies in the context of the pandemic. But again, this requires, as one of the pillars, that the state plays a role in aligning expectations with what is macroeconomically feasible.
Thank you. Building directly on that is someone from your old program. Santiago Hermo has the following message in question. Thanks, Martin. Really nice to have you here, especially for Argentinian econ PhD students. My question is about the control of inflation. In the past year, we observed a massive increase in the amount of money and some heterodox measures such as price controls and multiple exchange rates. What is different from Argentina that needs this kind of measures that have rarely been used to control inflation elsewhere in the world? More generally, what is your view on the idea that traditional theories don't apply to Argentina and therefore traditional policies don't work?
Thank you, Santiago, for your question and for your comment. Good. So in terms of the question on price controls and price and income policies, an economy that is already in a situation of stability doesn't need this. There is no need for a well-coordinated economy that the state plays a role in helping that coordination process, because already in a situation of stability, the market is doing the work of coordinating actions. Of course, then there are the views about the role of the state. We have a view at the time of defining economic policies that says that the state does play a role in resolving some market failures, in enabling strategic complementarities to occur. that is necessary for a virtuous process of economic development. The state plays a role, for instance, in the creation of knowledge, infrastructure policies, logistics policies, energy, education, public health, etc. This is different than macro coordination. On the other hand, in an economy that is suffering from problems of coordination, an economy that is resolving its macroeconomic inconsistencies and it's in uncoordinated state, the state does play a role in trying to coordinate the economy on a good equilibrium. We economists, well, Santiago is a PhD student, and we speak of multiple equilibria. And this, the economy can be on one point or another, depending on how the actions of all the economic agents in the economy are coordinated. Expectations matter. So it could be that everyone expects inflation to be of a certain level, say 20, and everyone will therefore make pricing decisions based on that expectation of future marginal costs. On the other hand, it could be that everyone expects inflation to be, say, 10, to say a number, therefore pricing decisions will be based on different expectations. Macroeconomically, 10 could be feasible, but if everyone expects 20, then there will be an equilibrium that is an inferior one. What does the state play? What does the state do? It plays a role in trying to coordinate actions on the good equilibrium. And that's the goal of what we are doing with the price and income policies. For instance, this morning we had a long meeting with all the unions in the country in order to coordinate a methodology and actions for how the wage policies are going to occur at the same time that we coordinate actions with the other side in order to have an alignment of prices and wages, in particular, is consistent with a recovery of real wages, which is a necessary condition also for an increase in aggregate demand that the economy needs in order to make more solid the process of economic recovery.
Thank you. So 3 questions have come in together, which I'm going to kind of group. So Marcel Parofo and Veronica Ingham ask more or less the same question, which is, how important is excessive and/or wasteful government expenditures in generating the structural fiscal imbalance that has been plaguing the economy for this period? And what kind of reforms beyond what you have said of the narrow corridor would be necessary to fix that if that was the case? Relatedly, if we get out of COVID, if there is a boom, and there seems to be incipient signs of a commodity boom emerging, would that complicate life for Argentina, or would it make it easier?
Very good. Thank you for the questions. First, in terms of spending, what we've done in the 2021 budget is to redefine priorities. Of course, the restructuring gives fiscal space to the economy in order to, for us to be able to implement the public policies that we consider are necessary for economic recovery in the short term and for sustained growth with inclusion in the medium term. So what have we done? At the time we redefined priorities, there are some spendings, mostly the interest payments that have been reduced, and others that have increased. The ones that increase are the ones that we consider have the maximum impact, both in the short term on the macroeconomy, but also in the medium term in terms of increasing the productive capacity of the economy, including the productive capacity in the tradable sector, in the exportable sector. I'm going to say a few more words about the role of exports and the importance of exports growth in a few moments. So there is an increase in the capital spending, spending in infrastructure, in housing, also in public education, public health, research and development, science. Second, in terms of reforms, the critical constraint for economic growth in Argentina has been the exports growth, the balance of payments constraint. The arithmetic is quite simple. When the economy grows, imports grow. If exports do not grow, we start to face tensions on the balance of payments, loss of foreign reserves. Eventually, there is a depreciation of the currency. That depreciation leads to CPI inflation. that reduces real wages. It leads to a reduction in the aggregate demand, which in turn means lower economic activity, lower employment. And that's what decreases imports and restores the external balance. A very well-known stop and go pattern that has been common in Latin America, but in Argentina has been very common. Okay? So exports growth is a necessary condition for sustained economic growth. The rules that we are articulating hand in hand, the public sector with the private sector, are oriented towards the goal of increasing exports as well. Not only reducing the fiscal imbalances, it is important to do that, as I said, at a pace that is consistent with economic recovery. But the first pillar, the most important constraint for economic growth is the balance of payment growth. So that's why we've been working with the different tradable sectors of the economy, the agro-industrial sector, the energy sector, the services intensive in knowledge sector, in order to build rules that provide more predictability and enable these sectors to exploit its potential, and therefore allows Argentina to experience a dynamic path of exports over the next few years.
Thank you for that answer. Again, I'm going to group two questions that have come in, one from YouTube and one from inside the Brown community. So Martin Courageous asks a more long-term question. Given that the Republic is preoccupied with COVID relief, how does the minister feel about the prospect of addressing other economic crises in Argentina, which existed before the pandemic and are quite deep-seated? For example, income inequality, commodity dependence, essentially shifting, if you will, the growth model to a better growth model. And then Mark Sobel has written in, which is a much narrower question, but also very important. Thank you for the thin corridor explanation. But given this, how big a primary deficit as a percentage of GDP can Argentina run in 21-22 without causing even more inflation or depreciation? Do you have the sources of financing lined up to cover that deficit? So one very long term and one immediate short term.
Very good. Let me get to both of them. And I in the previous question, there was a question about COVID that I didn't respond, so I'll get back to that one as well. COVID, what led us to adopt the measures that I defined earlier in the presentation for the principles of protecting the population in situation of vulnerability and protecting organizational capital and jobs, was the adoption of a lockdown, circulation restrictions. Today we still have COVID, but we have no lockdown. There are no mobility constraints at the ones that we had early at the beginning of the pandemic. So that changes the economic landscape. The economy, as I said before, is recovering with a heterogeneous pattern, but it is recovering, and the measures that are needed today are different than the ones that were needed at the beginning of the pandemic. With respect to the question on the primary deficit, Mark, so we defined for the 2021 budget a primary deficit goal of 4.5% of GDP. This is what we consider to be within that thin corridor. Part of this is financed with credit. This possibility has to do with the fact that since the moment we took office, we work on rebuilding the market for public debt in domestic currency and rebuilding the peso yield curve also as a departure point for the development of the domestic capital markets, which is something that we need to develop in order to increase the levels of savings that the country needs in order to finance investments that are necessary for economic growth. And we will aim at reducing that primary fiscal deficit over time. Again, it takes time. That's why that's one of the reasons within multiple reasons why we also have to be gradual in the process of reduction of inflation.
Great. We actually have 10 minutes left. I've got a couple of questions in here. I'm going to ask Bill if he wants to come in and ask anything at this point. What do you think, Bill?
Well, one of the things I wanted to ask Martin, because he's covered a lot of subjects here, inflation, growth, COVID. But one of the points I think that is so important is the foreign trade situation between Argentina and its neighbors. And I'd like some comments, Martin, from how you see Mercosur functioning these days, because there's been a lot of criticism that it hasn't worked out as well as it should, and talks about a possible merger with the Pacific Alliance. So first of all, do you think that in this age of COVID, Mercosur is functioning properly? And do you hold any hope for some eventual merger with the so-called Pacific Alliance? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bill. So let me go step by step with the issue of Mercosur. So first, Mercosur over the last few years sort of lost the traction that it had in other years, and it will be good to revive or deepen the strategic ties, not just because of economic reasons, but for a number of reasons that go beyond the economy in the Mercosur. On the other hand, recently there's been dialogue between President Fernandez from our country and President Bolsonaro from the Republic of Brazil. Argentina and Brazil are two countries that have big strategic complementarities, and it's healthier it's good for the development of the region that these strategic complementarities are in fact exploited. And we look forward to that. With respect to the issue of the European Union and the Mercosur deal, in our different meetings in Europe with the European leaders, what we've seen is the same that we saw also in parts of our continent, which is that this deal was done in not facing the public, not very open to the public. There was the type of discussion that gives the robust support that the kind of deal that one needs to have, and that's why basically it did not transcend. In any case, Argentina looks forward to continue working with the European Union in order to define trade relations that are mutually beneficial for our country and for Europe. I guess I left one of your questions aside, but I guess I responded to most of them.
No, I wanted to just ask you about all of these, questions you hear and statements, maybe idealistically, about a possible merger of Mercosur with the Pacific Alliance. And some people even talk about that in context of an arrangement between the two with the EU, which you commented on. Because your neighbors on the other side of the Andes are also important to you. So maybe you want to comment on that.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't. I don't have much to add to that because we are not at a point in which there's anything solid to say about that. So there are comments, but I wouldn't comment on that as on the basis of some solid agreements or anything that is worth of being discussed at the moment.
So we do have two questions that are a little more micro and Argentina focused, and I think they're both very interesting. So I'm going to take the focus away from this kind of macro and monetary focus towards here. Barbara Stallings, I think, is looking for some inside information here, but here is the question. I realize this is not your portfolio, but I wonder if you have any insights about the recent news from Argentina. This news says Argentina has managed to snag a deal with China to produce batteries and even electric cars rather than selling raw lithium to China. Is this true? And if this is the case, how was this deal achieved?
No, Mark, I have no comments about that.
I thought as much, but I thought I would ask. And then similarly, Pedro Martino from Uber asks, thank you for your time. I'd like to have your view about how the tech environment could help Argentine recovery after COVID. And what are your thoughts about the debates related to taxing the digital ecosystem?
Taxing the digital ecosystem?
Yes.
So there are long-term issues here that we're talking about, the digital transition, and we consider that the knowledge sector and the digital economy is an important part of our economy that needs to be developed. That's why in 2020, the National Congress passed a law that defines rules, it gives predictability for the development of the knowledge-intensive sector, which we call Economía del Conocimiento. That's basically the framework that is going to stand for now. It's a framework that we consider solid, and it will remain in time for the time that the law establishes.
So this might be our last one, depending on the length of the answer. But Lucrezia Yarlegorda asked the following question, which I'm going to add something onto myself as I suppose I want to. First, thank you for your time. As expectations matter, as you say, how are we going to generate positive signals to improve expectations? In other words, how do we build trust for investors? And I'd like to put this in a bigger context. The Macri administration, which preceded your government, was very much favored by international institutions and was seen in a very positive light. They made noises of gradualismo, etc. It had a great deal of market confidence. The IMF backed this. And then, as you noted in your talk earlier on, suddenly expectation changed. And all of that that was good suddenly became bad and became a problem. Given the fickleness of expectations and confidence, do you think it is possible for your administration to actually really change expectations in a way that bolsters confidence and stability?
Well, thank you very much for the question. Certainly, we've seen this happening now. We're seeing this happening now. Expectations about economic growth, about the economic prospects have been changing lately. But in order to go straight to the question, how do we build trust for investors? How do we build trust in general for investment in the country? Three parts to that question. First, the macroeconomic program to address the imbalances of the economy, which is what we're doing, what I explained in the presentation. Second, clarity about the rules of the game, the rules of the economy. And third, and related to the second point, constructive engagement. We need to strengthen the nation state. So the public and the private sector working hand in hand. The process matters. The process itself builds understanding, it builds knowledge, it creates knowledge, and it makes any set of rules more robust. So again, macro, in order to resolve the imbalances of the economy, clear rules, and constructive engagement.
Great. We have time for one more, well, possibly two. Sofia Vidotto, who's one of the PhD students in political science, asks, again, it's a confidence question. Considering the Argentine central bank reserves are increasingly low, are you considering any specific plans or policies to build citizens' trust back in the national currency?
Well, but the central bank reserves have been growing. So in the times of the pandemic, we were experiencing a declining path. Then there was an adaptation of the policies when the circulation restrictions were left aside. And what we've been observing, we've been experiencing over the last 2 months and a half is a growth in foreign reserves at the central bank. And the goal is to continue along that path. In order to build external resilience, accumulation of foreign reserves is one of the goals.
So I will ask one very quickly and then pass over to Bill for a last comment as we're in the home stretch. It very much seems to be the policy consensus in the COVID moment that austerity is not the way to go, particularly in the global north. But from your perspective as a finance minister in the global south, do you see that as being the same policy consensus? Or is it still the same kind of austerian instinct in international institutions still there? Is there one law for the north and another one for the south still? Or has there been a better equilibrium for
Thank you very much for the question. So certainly austerity is not the way to go. In a recession, especially in the context of a pandemic, not in the north, not anywhere. At the same time, it's clear that the financing constraints are different in different countries. There are economies that have already built a credit capacity, financing capacity that allows them to have a more expansionary, allows the state to have a more expansionary role than economies that do not have that capacity. So that's why it's important to find a balance between the different goals that an economy needs to achieve. When it comes to Argentina, that balance means that the state has to play a role in order to ensure that there is a sustained economic recovery, but in order to make sure that there is stability in the short term and in the medium term, also fiscal sustainability has to be respected, and in a context in which the credit constraints are tighter and dependence of monetary financing is larger, that puts a different kind of limit to what the state can do with respect to advanced economies that have more financing capacity. In any case, the macroeconomic approach that we have defined is clearly oriented to both the goal of pushing economic recovery in the short term and the medium term, and building conditions for making economic stability long-lasting.
Thank you. Bill, do you have any last-minute questions you would like to ask Martin?
I think just to make a final statement, I think, Martin, you inherited, it's fair to say, a very difficult economic situation. Some people would say a mess caused by the failure of gradualismo. That was compounded by the COVID-19 pandemic. And I think the work you were able to do on the restructuring, given these conditions, I think laid a basis for moving forward. I think one of the problems that Argentina has faced, certainly during my long career, has been a battle against inflation. And I think it's always been underestimated. And so I think that the key for your success going forward is to really be able to control inflation and get the confidence back with the population. And that will lead to a path of growth. When I started out there, they had something called la bicicleta, which you probably remember, from your student days earlier on. And that is characterized, I think, the mentality that Argentina has shown in all of these various economic programs, the Austral program, I could go through all sorts of them. And I think you have an opportunity here, notwithstanding all the problems you've inherited and now exacerbated by COVID-19, to really establish a base of confidence within the Argentine population. And if you can do that, then you will attract foreign investment, because foreign investment goes where there's confidence in the local population. So I congratulate you on the work you're doing. We're all very proud of you in the sense of the work you have done since you left Brown. And I know Joe Stiglitz, the well-known Nobel Prize economist, always speaks of how proud he is that you worked with him. So all I can do is wish you buena suerte and just hang in there, because I think you're pursuing the proper policies, and hopefully you will get the political backing from the president and vice president in order to carry out your program.
Thank you very much for those comments, Bill. Minister, any final words?
Well, first, Bill, thank you very much for your thoughtful words, thoughtful comments, for your support. Thank you always. Mark, thank you very much as well. We've learned also a lot from you, from your work, and it's a pleasure to have this discussion. And thank you to the Brown community and all the audience. I was glad to see that there were some PhD students attending the presentation. And I very much hope to get a chance, when COVID allows, to be there in person, as I said in the introduction. It would be a great pleasure to be back at Brown and have a meaningful discussion there.
We will always welcome you back home. It's been an excellent conversation. Thank you for taking the time to join with us today. Thank you, Bill, for your comments. Always welcome. And thank you to everyone who came on today and asked such excellent questions. It's been a wonderful event. Thank you to everyone.